François Riquier, Progressive Hardening, Moral Blindness, and the Long Journey of Learning, the Testimony of the Spirit. François Riquier, presented in the second part of Heaven and Hell, reveals a spiritual state marked by prolonged moral hardening, difficulty in recognizing one's own mistakes, and persistent resistance to inner transformation. His account shows that suffering can become more enduring when consciousness avoids honest confrontation with itself. François Riquier manifests with preserved identity and sufficient lucidity to perceive that he continues to exist after the death of the body. However, he demonstrates great difficulty in accepting that his current condition is directly linked to the choices made in life. He tends to minimize his responsibilities, justify his attitudes, and shift the cause of his suffering to external factors. This defensive posture keeps consciousness in a state of stagnation. Modern depth psychology helps to understand this picture. When an individual develops continuous mechanisms of denial and self-justification throughout life, they create a rigid psychic structure. This rigidity prevents the processing of mistakes and blocks moral maturation. On the spiritual plane, where there are no longer social reinforcements to sustain these defenses, suffering emerges, but without producing immediate learning. Spiritism clarifies that François Riquier's suffering does not stem from the isolated severity of his actions, but from the persistence in not recognizing them honestly. As long as the conscience refuses to accept the law of cause and effect as just and educational, suffering repeats itself without real progress. In this case, pain does not transform because it encounters constant inner resistance. Modern science reinforces this reading by showing that processes of change require cognitive and emotional flexibility. Closed systems tend to repeat the same patterns. In psychology, the refusal to take personal responsibility is one of the greatest obstacles to personality evolution. On a spiritual level, this refusal prolongs states of disturbance and delay. Another striking point of the testimony is the progressive insensitivity to the suffering of others. François Riquier demonstrates difficulty in perceiving the impact of his attitudes on other consciousnesses. This empathetic closure limits the development of moral feeling, which is essential for inner liberation. Consciousness remains centered on itself, unable to broaden its vision. Spiritism teaches that no one is condemned to this state, but it also makes it clear that progress cannot be imposed. The consciousness must want to learn. As long as François Riquier insists on defending his own ego instead of listening to his own conscience, suffering will continue to serve only as a signal, not as effective learning. This testimony offers us a direct and necessary warning. Continuously justifying oneself may temporarily alleviate discomfort, but it prevents real transformation. Spiritual evolution begins when the consciousness abandons defenses and takes responsibility for its own path. François Riquier teaches us, by contrast, that the greatest enemy of progress is not error, but the refusal to acknowledge it. An admitted error transforms into learning. A denied error repeats itself as pain. Spiritual justice is patient, but it demands inner sincerity. Reflecting on this account is an invitation to be honest with oneself in the present, acknowledging flaws, accepting corrections, and developing empathy now is the safest way to avoid long journeys of suffering later. Awareness grows when it stops defending itself and begins to learn. If this testimony helped you reflect on responsibility, inner resilience, and spiritual progress, like, share, and leave your comment. Your participation helps this message reach more people.